I have very little idea where to start, because if I was an effective public speaker, I probably wouldn't be a writer. The way I got into this shtick, and what you just heard is my full-time day job. I'm the music editor at Time Out New York, which is a glossy, regular-sized weekly arts and entertainment magazine in New York City. The magazine has been around for about 15 years. I've been around for about nearly 10 of those years, which is really, really weird to me, because spending 10 years at one job just seems very surreal in the 21st century. But there it is. That's my day job, and it's what basically pays the bills and brings in the all-important health insurance. And then my nighttime job is that I'm also a reviewer for the New York Times. I don't work for the New York Times. I'm a stringer, a freelancer. I have a relationship with them where they hire me and they send me out 3-4 times a week just to review concerts. The sort of bipolar nature of what it is that I do for those two publications also speaks to the very weird sort of musical background that I bring to the job, which is that I started out, I played drums for a long time. I wanted to be the new drummer for Kiss. That was where it originally started. And so I was definitely into to rock and pop and jazz and whatever, definitely all over on the non-classical side of the world. But at the same time, being a serious music student, I got a lot of classical background as well. And when I went to college, I did my undergrad in San Antonio at Trinity University, small liberal arts college. They called themselves the Harvard of the South. It's kind of like Rice University Junior. They had a radio station on campus that was about 90% classical. So I spent a lot of my growing up time in the classical music world as well, and came to be very adept at it, and also realized that I cared a lot about it. So the way that I got to my current position was kind of a very strange, long, circuitous way. I started undergrad basically wanting to be a psychology major. I think, like every high school student who ever went through therapy, they decide that since their lives were saved, they owe it to the world to become therapists. After about a year and a half, I realized that there was basically too much math involved, and dropped that in a hot moment. And really, by my sophomore year, didn't have any idea what it was that I ought to be doing. And a high school advisor one weekend said, well, Steve, you've always liked to talk at great length, so why don't you check out communications? Strangely enough, that's what I did, and just kind of never really departed from that path. Communications major at that time meant that I got some hands-on experience writing and reporting, but Trinity being a liberal arts college, they didn't want to sort of give you a kind of nuts and bolts how-to sort of vocational education. So we got a lot of media theory. We spent a lot of time debating McLuhan and all those things that you do to sort of puff up the communications track. But there was an on-campus newspaper for which I started writing record reviews my sophomore year. Actually, my first clip was not in the college paper. It was in an alt weekly that was published by a local record store in San Antonio. So from the start, I was basically writing record reviews, and because I was not yet an established reviewer with contacts among the media, I wrote about the records that I bought. So, of course, my clips were fairly esoteric because that's where my tastes were. I did 3 years at the college newspaper, which forced me to be kind of a generalist. I was actually looking through my college clips 2 nights ago just to see what it was that I had written about, because I am so music intensive now. My wife, who works for NPR as a freelancer, actually gives me a little bit of grief because she tries to be a generalist and cover a little bit of everything, and I'm very, very intensively and purposefully a music person. And so I was looking at my clips the other day to see what it was that I had written about in college, and about 60% of it was music writing. But there were restaurant reviews, there were movie reviews, there were interviews with people who were coming to lecture on campus.
I got the sense, actually, retrospectively, that I was thrown into a lot more than I had actually thought at the time, which was kind of cool. Because when you get out and you are working, you know, as a working journalist, you do tend to get sort of pigeonholed into a niche. You're a specialist at this, or you do that. After college, I went to work for a classical radio station in Houston. That was like my first grown-up real communications job, if you can call it that. It basically consisted of sitting in a small room surrounded by glass, playing records for people 5 hours a day. And this is classical music, so every 20 minutes or so, I turned on a microphone and told people what they were hearing and what they would hear next. And that was, it was a nice step up, but by that time, I had kind of already decided that I had to get to New York somehow. So my career path wasn't nearly so much a purposeful winnowing down of communications opportunities. It was basically, how in the world do I get to New York by any means necessary? That was really it. My sister did undergraduate at New York University. I walked up out of the subway the first time, kind of looked around, and I was like, this is it. This is where I have to be. And this is actually where the communications degree came in handy. Because what I did was stepped out of the communication, out of the journalism and criticism and radio track, and spent my first 7 years in New York in public relations. It was a good thing in a couple of different ways. Although you don't usually, it's not really common to have started in communications and then gone to public relations and then come back. That doesn't happen so much. It can happen, but it's not the common track. But what I discovered right around the time that I was moving from Texas to New York, I had this sort of peculiar crisis of confidence. It was kind of like this sort of philosophical epiphany. Oh my God, I'm just some schmuck from Houston. What right do I have to give an opinion on the new record by fill in the blank? It was kind of like, what is it that entitles me to have an opinion on, you know, whoever the popular artist is who has nowadays it would be like, you know, why do I have the right to write about Kanye West? I haven't done all the things that he's done. So, you know, that equivalent. And public relations for me was an interesting way to be involved in the music business and use my writing skills and use my talking skills. And at the same time, it was all, to me, a very sort of positive and proactive and productive kind of stance. I wasn't being critical of anybody. I wasn't going to hurt anybody's feelings. I was basically just enabling artists to have their own careers. And that was very satisfying for me for about the first 5 years out of the 7. The jobs kept progressively going upwards. I started at a fairly obscure classical music record label, made my segue to a downtown New York experimental nightclub called the Knitting Factory, which was where I really wanted to be. That lasted for about 6 months and taught me that you should be very careful what you wish for, because sometimes when you pull back the curtain on The Wizard of Oz, there really is just a little guy pulling levers and holding things together with chewing gum. But it was a great experience in terms of just learning life lessons. And again, a couple more jobs led me to my biggest PR job ever. And I say ever because that was the end of the line for me. I ended up as the head of jazz and world music publicity for RCA. So one of the now 4 major labels. We had a great roster. We had exciting artists. We were going to take over the world. And 10 months later, the corporation discontinued my entire department. And I said, okay, been there, done that, time to go back. Happily, I was able to move pretty smoothly back into the communications world because one of the editors that I worked with in my capacity as a publicist had an opening coming up at Jazz Is, which was, and I think is again, I think they suspended for a while, but it's a monthly national jazz magazine. And so, again, you kind of get the sense that I was sort of going all over the map and just sort of following where the career led me rather than having a sort of purposeful roadmap to where it was that I was going. Was by definition a temporary position, but it got me back over into the journalism side. And just about the time that was ending, Billboard magazine, the weekly recording industry publication, they actually called me up sort of out of the blue, and they said, we've got an opening for somebody to write about the recording industry, the classical music recording industry. Are you interested? I had thought that I had spent about 10 years trying to extract myself from classical music. It wasn't where my head was. It wasn't what I was interested in anymore. I was into jazz. I was into rock. I was into the most esoteric strains of underground Norwegian death metal. And so classical music was really just not where my head was. But I said, well, it's a job, and it's an opportunity to work for a reputable publication and have a weekly deadline, which was about the most intense deadline I had dealt with any time after college. What I found, weirdly enough, was that by having stepped away from the classical music business for a while, my interest in the music had actually come back. And so I have very willingly been writing about classical music for the better part of 12, 13 years now. And it's a really interesting time to be writing about classical music because most of the composers who are doing interesting things these days are people who are your age, or they're just a little bit older. And they write classical music that's based on having come up through an academic background and based on having learned the fundamentals of every composer who wrote music over the last 400 years. But they also grew up with Kanye West and the Arcade Fire and all these other things on their iPods, and they don't see any reason why they should filter out their life experience from what it is that they write. Arguably, when you're making music, your music is an expression of who you are inside, and these are people who grew up listening to Radiohead, so that manifests itself in the classical music that they write. That puts me in an interesting position because having been engaged in classical music and pop music for all of my life, I kind of feel like I have sort of one leg up on understanding what it is that today's emerging composers are doing. And that's valuable to me because some of my scary colleagues who have really, really intense musical backgrounds and studied musicology and got PhDs at Yale or whatever, I look at them and I think, wow, they really know a lot more about this subject matter than I do. They've sat and they've analyzed Beethoven piano sonatas, and they can tell you each of Schubert's 500 songs. But while I might not have that sort of depth of focus to my own background, I can talk to what contemporary composers are doing. And that's extremely important to me, the whole notion that music is still being made, and just like there are new hip-hop mixtapes, and just like there are new metal demos, there are new classical pieces being written all the time. And because that's such a marginalized area of the mass media where you don't see composers being interviewed on the evening news, it's almost weirdly become kind of a mission for me to just try and get the word out about who these younger people are, what it is that motivates them, what it is that they're writing, and why you should care. So in a weird way, and I'm totally stealing this from another writer, from Alex Ross, who's probably the most popular and successful classical music writer there is right now. In a very weird way, for me, classical music is kind of like, it's the new alt-rock. Because if you turn on the TV, you're going to hear Arcade Fire and Sleigh Bells and whoever the current buzz bands are on Xbox commercials, or you're going to hear them on iPhone commercials, or you're totally soaking in what used to be the alternative. Whereas classical music is so marginalized and appeals to such a small core of really passionate listeners that it's almost like what was once high culture has become counterculture. That's an exciting place for me to be right now because it sort of, it appeals to my sense of unstructured rebellion or whatever the heck it is that got me to this point. But it's also, it's dipping into all the music that I care about and trying to synthesize it in a way that's meaningful. So the reality of my career is that I spend my days at Time Out New York, where I supervise a staff of 5 really, really good music writers, each of whom has different skills and different interests, and each of whom will argue passionately about whether Kanye West's new record was in fact the #1 record of the year or just a pretty good Kanye record. And that appeals to a big part of me. And then in the evenings, I usually can be found at Carnegie Hall or the Metropolitan Opera, and I'm sitting there listening to a concert in real time, scribbling notes in a notebook that I typically then won't even go back and look at, because it's kind of like my process is writing down the notes is the act of thinking about what it is that I'm listening to. And then when I sit down in front of my computer that night or the next morning to file my reviews are due at 11 a.m. the next morning. By that time, I think the act of scribbling in the dark has sort of internalized whatever it was that I was thinking and was going to say, and then I just have to find the right words to say it. So it is a weird and, please don't think that I'm like trying to pat myself on the back, because I'm not. My position is very weird, but I think it's also, I find it exciting and useful to be living in both the pop and classical worlds, because when you come to artists like, well, Radiohead is one that I've mentioned, but Sufjan Stevens is another, and My Brightest Diamond, Shara Worden, this singer who does her own stuff that's very ornate and very influenced by classical chamber music, and yet at the same time she's doing gigs with Sufjan Stevens and the Decemberists. There's this whole weird merging of contemporary classical music and what would best be described as indie rock. It's a very fertile area, and I feel like I've kind of got a really good perspective on how to deal with it and how to analyze it and how to talk about it. So if there is some useful endpoint to my very strange, long and winding road to where I am now, it would be that maybe the sum of my experiences and the fact that I did a little bit here and a little bit there kind of puts me in a position to comprehend young artists, young composers, young musicians who are very much doing the same, who are very much synthesizing strange and disparate things. A few nights ago, at a nightclub on Bleecker Street it's not the equivalent of Bourbon Street, but it's the main one of the main drags for nightclubs. And there's a nightclub called Le Poisson Rouge that came along about 2 years ago that specializes in doing alt-rock one night and techno another night and straight up classical music the third night, and then every now and then the niches in between where that music bleeds together. And so last week I remember reviewing a chamber orchestra that was doing a piece that involved techno beats in the actual music. It's an exciting place to be, and however I stumbled to this weird sort of bifurcated existence, it seemed to have been the right moment. I'm sure I jumped over a whole lot of things there.
No, I don't think so. You want to just take some questions?
Sure, please.
So you were saying that
Yeah.
basically what you did is you kind of dabbled in all these different areas.
Yes.
So you were first journalism, and then you moved to communications. Why did you choose to make that switch?
Well, again, part of it was just opportunity. Part of it was because my primary goal was just get to New York by any means necessary. And at the classical radio station that I was working at, part of the relationship that I had, even just being at a small classical radio station in Houston, I was in pretty much daily contact with people who were promoting records from New York. And I just built those relationships and made it known among the circle of people that I was working with that someday I'd like to come up and investigate what it is that they were doing. And what happened was one of the publicists at a record company decided that she was going to leave her job and just gave them my name as somebody who might be a replacement. And it didn't exactly work that way. I didn't go up with zero experience and become a publicist at a classical record label in New York. But they saw something and they brought me up to be an assistant to the person that they hired. So it was kind of like they wanted to use me as a resource and tap into whatever it was that I brought, while at the same time acknowledging on all sides that I wasn't ready to hold the job yet myself. And I did have a lot to learn about how publicity worked, because the biggest part of publicity is not writing press releases or knowing how to deal with social media. The biggest part of publicity is personal relationships between the publicist and the writer or radio person that he or she is dealing with, because you really have to kind of get inside that person's head and get to know them a little bit. You know, which writer is it who is going to bite your head off if you dare to call him on a Thursday? You know, or which radio programmer is it who really, really loves opera recordings from the 1930s but is not going to care about your new symphonic recording from last year? You really have to get to know people on a pretty one-on-one basis. And you know, especially in the high old times of the record industry, when everybody was flush and making money, so this is all pre-download and pre-BitTorrent, lavish expense account lunches were the norm. It was where a lot of business was done. You know, a publicist would take an editor out and for 3 hours ply him or her with lavish food and drinks and talk about projects sort of peripherally, but it was all basically a very elaborate sort of courtship of getting to know you. Because in the end, you know, a publicist can work any project effectively. Even if a publicist doesn't actually personally believe in that project, you can work it. But what you can't fake is your knowledge of the writers and editors that you're working with. That's the key to publicity right there. So that's what I spent a lot of my time learning in those 7 years. I was meeting writers and getting to know them, getting to know what they did. So I was sort of, maybe all along kind of, backing my way into a position where I could be a writer. But it also goes back to what I was talking about before about my crisis of confidence, where at a certain point I just sort of said, who am I to cast judgment on artist X? I mean, they're making a living and they're far more important and rich and more powerful than I'll ever be, so what gives me the right to say something about them? And the thing is, that's something that I think I kind of unlearned. Because in college, when I was writing for the school paper, if I wanted to give, okay, I'm dating myself here, but if I wanted to give the new Van Halen record 1 star and say it stunk, I just did it. You have a certain liberty when you're writing for a college paper because you know your audience well, you know who's reading you, and I think you also have a sense that, you know, you're there to express yourself, and nothing you say is likely to, you know, bring the attention of the artist down on you. You know, if you give, I keep saying the same name because he's ubiquitous. He sort of owns us all. But you know, if I'm in a college paper and I say something bad about the new Kanye record, actually he's probably a bad example because he'll get on Twitter and he probably will sound off about it, won't he? But you know what I mean? You know, there are no repercussions. You know, you don't feel like you're in danger of, you know, hurting somebody's livelihood. And that was the point that I got to, and not every writer does, but I did. I reached a point where I was like, who am I to cast judgment? And it took a long time to get over that, actually. But at a certain point I realized, well, who I am is somebody who has played music on and off for the better part of 20 years, and who has listened to music for even longer, and you know, who has a vested interest and a pretty deep well of knowledge in terms of all the various things that I've spent my life listening to and thinking about and reading and doing. And so it wasn't that I ever said, okay, I'm going to be Steve Smith, all-powerful critic, and I'm going to make or break your career. But it was more kind of, I do have a perspective, and I do have a way that I can communicate what it is that I saw, ideally to an audience that wasn't there. My philosophy in terms of sitting in a concert hall as a reviewer is basically tell people who weren't here what this was like in some meaningful way. And music is really hard because, you know, it's like you can't actually write a sentence that is going to convey everything about a symphony or for that matter, about a Justin Bieber concert. You know, you just can't. But you find ways to sort of describe what it is that you're seeing and hearing in terms of, you know, you describe the music, sure, but you also describe what the scene is like, you know, what the audience is doing. Are they engaged? Are they bored? Is the show working? Is it not working? Did somebody fall off the stage? I mean, really just sort of painting a picture. It's kind of, it's basically just reporting with an opinion. You know, because when you're a straight up reporter, you're supposed to be sort of filtering your own opinion out of it. And we all know that that's not really possible, that every reporter has a little bit of a perspective. But straight up reporting news pieces, and I do that for the Times, for Time Out, for whomever, that's not so much about my perspective as just sort of communicating the who, what, where, when, and why. In reviewing, it's very much about how I filter that information for other people, how I want to paint a picture. You know, there was a review last week where I went and saw 2 concerts by a particular Hungarian orchestra, and I was sitting there in the seat just like crazy blown away by how good they were. Really, really, and I finally, I decided to get really, really over the top. And the thing is, doing that for the New York Times really does feel a little bit strange and enhanced, because you know that it's one of a handful of papers that people read all over the world and take to be some kind of, you know, arbiter of what's right. And, you know, I've been writing for the New York Times for 5 years. I know I haven't changed. I'm still the same dork that I was when I started. But, you know, they came and found me based on writing that I had done elsewhere, and they wanted to incorporate my voice and my experience and my perspective into what it is they do. In a way, it was extremely flattering. I tried to get into the New York Times for a whole lot of years. I was just like every other freelancer, pitching the editor, not hearing answers for months and months and months at a time, banging my head against the wall. I did a couple of Sunday pieces for them in the arts and leisure section and thought that something was starting, and then again 5, 6 months, a year with no response. And eventually I gave up on them. And this is something I actually, in a weird circuitous way, like I do everything, you've brought me to a really, really interesting point that I want to convey to everybody because it's really important, which is that at a certain point, I stopped waiting for the Times. I stopped waiting for anybody. I was working at Time Out New York, but Time Out New York doesn't review concerts. Time Out New York is not reflexive. It's very much consumer advocacy. It's writing in advance of the concert and telling people what it is they should go do and why they should care. So in that respect, it's very much like the Gambit. It's basically telling you what's going on that week and why this concert is better than that concert. So I was getting to write a lot of advanced pieces, but I wasn't getting to express my personal opinion, my reflection on what was going on. And so I did what basically everybody in the 21st century has done at one point or another. I started a blog. And the blog was and is called Night After Night. It's still online, although it doesn't get updated for weeks and months at a time now because I just never get around to it. But the blogging was a way for me to document the things that I saw. It was a way for me to force myself to take my thoughts and put them into some sort of readable and reasonably concise form that another reader could come along and sort of look over and say, okay, well, that's what happened. And the turning point for me in the blog was that I'm about 25 miles from where your question was, aren't I? The turning point was that literally there was a concert that I wanted to go to, and I couldn't go. And so I said, well, okay, I'll read what the other reviewers have to say. And then nobody reviewed it. So it was as if the concert had never happened. And that to me felt wrong. You know, it was an exciting event. It was something that I wanted to hear about and that I was sure there were at least 12 to 100 other people who would want to read about. And so the purpose of my blog, you know, was basically to create some durable record of everything that I had seen. You know, And it was mostly out of a sense of obligation to the artists because it's no real secret that as a full-time music writer and as an editor, I don't pay to get into things. And it's kind of really, really weird and freaky and cool for me to be able to get into Madison Square Garden or the Metropolitan Opera by sending an email to somebody. But that didn't, I still felt like I had this weird kind of obligation where I was just sitting there partaking of what the artists were doing, but not giving anything back. And so, you know, as noble and high-minded as this sounds, the blog was some little way of giving something back. It was just basically creating a record of what happened and who was there and what it was like and what it meant. And around that time, my then girlfriend, now wife, got a job teaching at the University of Richmond. So she moved to Virginia for 2 years, and I literally had no reason to go home at night. So night after night was basically about an experiment in going to a concert every single night and sitting down and writing about it that night, getting something up anywhere between 2 a.m. and 4 a.m. And, you know, in terms of discipline, in terms of getting myself into a mindset where I've got a deadline, I have something to turn in, it was kind of like teaching myself the ropes. And after about 3 years of doing that, weirdly enough, I swear to God, the Times came looking for me. They had an opening and somebody said, you should check out this guy. And the editor who hadn't been returning my calls for 5 months at a time was suddenly calling me and taking me to lunch. So I got really, really lucky. But, you know, that's not to say that having a blog is going to get you a job automatically, but it is a great, great way to find your voice and to just get into the rhythm and the discipline of writing all the time. Because nothing makes you a better writer more than just writing. So that's like 50 miles from where we started. Did I even answer your question?
Yeah.
Okay.
Because I know like with a lot of people with their blogs, like it really helps to get them out there. Like people will write blogs about the crazy things.
Mm-hmm.
Puts their name out there.
Yeah, it has been a really revolutionary tool. And I think one of the debates that's going on right now, in fact, going on right now in a lot of the newspapers I've been reading over the last couple of weeks, is whether critics have, newspaper critics, traditional critics, have any meaning whatsoever anymore. Because everyone's got a blog, so you can find, you know, 2 or 3 or a dozen different interpretations and viewpoints on everything. And, you know, with Twitter and with Facebook, you've got an immediacy that weren't there before. You don't have to wait until, you know, the day after tomorrow to find out what the critic thought. You can just go on Twitter and see, you know, several dozen opinions of what you've just been at, and you can weigh in yourself. So it has become a much, much more, you know, democratically open kind of environment for everybody to do some writing. But at the same time, I do actually think that critics serve a purpose just in terms of being a skilled listener, a listener who isn't better than any other listener who went to that concert, but who put in the time and energy to provide perspectives and contexts that not everybody who was there might bring to bear in writing about it. And again, you know, my example is so bizarre because it's the way that I want to be, in terms of, you know, every now and then I think, boy, it would be great if I really just focused on classical music and became that guy who, like, you know, sounded like he lectures at Yale and, you know, spends all of his time listening to Beethoven sonatas and analyzing form and things like that. And I think, no, that would be really, really boring because at the same time, I'm still, this is going to be the most embarrassing thing that I admit today, so excuse me in advance. I'm still the dork who went to see the Justin Bieber concert and got a little bit teary because Miley Cyrus made an unannounced guest appearance, and that was like really, really, oh my God, it's my, okay. I'm sorry, I'm sorry, but it's true, it's true. It was kind of like this unannounced guest appearance. He was shooting at Madison Square Garden for his 3D movie in the making, and the Justin Bieber thing was not something that I was excited about. I'm not really a fan, but I wanted to witness the experience, and it was kind of valuable in terms of now I know what 20,000 screaming 11-year-olds sound like. but it was fun, and it was just kind of another facet of everything that's going on. And I don't have to like Justin Bieber, but I do have to know what it is that he does. And I don't have to think that Kanye made the best record of the year, but I do have to know what that record was, what it was about, because everybody from Pitchfork, talk about bloggers. There's somebody who started out fairly low key as a blogger and is now, the leading authority in the music business. Everybody kowtows to Pitchfork the way 20 years ago they used to be, about Rolling Stone. Rolling Stone now is kind of this marginalized fossil of an earlier era, and Pitchfork is where everybody wants to be reviewed. So, on my Time Out New York side of things, where I've got the staff of writers who write for me, and I also, write about pop music there, I do take it very seriously that I have to be at least a little bit aware of everything that's going on. And, my tastes kind of blow with the wind. 2 years ago, when every critic at the end of the year has to do the obligatory top 10 list, and you have to think about everything that you heard all year and winnow it down to, here are the 10 records that were the best of the best. And what that really means is, here are the 10 records that I actually sort of vibed with the most, that meant the most to me. And so 2 years ago was a really, really good hip-hop year, and I remember number 1 and number 2 were Nas and Lil Wayne. And then last year, weirdly enough, was barely a hip-hop record. Well, Kanye. That was the one that made my list, because somehow my ears were on other things. And it's a little bit schizophrenic. There are people who are a lot more authoritative in one area or another. There are like 900 hip-hop writers that I would recommend you read before me. But having that working knowledge lets me exist in the pop environment. And in a weird way, again, going back to what I was saying before, more and more of these young contemporary classical composers grew up with hip-hop on their iPods, and they're finding ways to incorporate that in not corny, not cheesy ways into their music. That took about 10 years for people to figure out how to do that rather than rapping over an orchestra. But it's happening now. And while I don't have that ability to draw from memory, every measure of every movement of every Mozart sonata, at least when I'm confronted with a new composer who spent time listening to Nas, so did I. So I know where that composer is coming from, and I can talk about it in a way that the Beethoven guy can't. That to me feels like a satisfactory ending to a really, really weird and circuitous way of having gotten where I'm at. Again, did I even come close to answering that? I feel like I'm getting off on these weird tangents, and it's just telling stories about myself. And the thing about the fact that I'm making a living as a full-time music writer and editor in New York City, it's surprising and shocking and extremely gratifying to me. The communications world, the journalism world is contracting. Papers have gone out of business. A lot of writers have ended up out of work. I sometimes think that it is my bizarre versatility that has sort of kept me viable, because at the Times I'm not a full-timer. I'm just a stringer that they throw at a few concerts. At Time Out, I'm sort of the guy who decides what's going to get into the magazine. That's still kind of a slightly weird and freaky thing for me, coming from my background and with my experience and with my whatever my past insecurities were, to know that I'm working at a fairly popular, a really popular weekly New York magazine, and that I'm the one who decides what's going to get into the pages. I mean, if I stopped to think about what that responsibility entails, I'd probably, shrink and go back to bed. But it's just kind of like I think about what is it that I would like to read about, and what is it that I feel like we have a responsibility to be a part of. My own listening tastes are really, on the esoteric side, But at the same time, when I just copped to Miley Cyrus a few minutes ago, that's because I'm actually a fan, weirdly enough, of a lot of what she does. And knowing what's going on in the broader pop culture, I think, is really important, because at Time Out, we're not a specialized music magazine. We're an all-purpose entertainment magazine, and so there are going to be people coming from all walks of life looking at what we do, and some of them are going to want to read about, the big popular stars, as opposed to the esoteric black metal influenced indie rock band that's playing on Ludlow Street. So we cover both. And I have a good team of 5 writers who basically cover all the bases, and anything that those 5 writers don't really have, in terms of their intuitive skills, I hire freelancers to augment that. So I've got people who really, really, really know hip hop cold. I've got jazz specialists and just a sort of outer pool of people that I dip into, and what I put on the pages is some mix of me and my staff and the freelancers, with the idea of putting together something that's useful and informative to the reader.
We've got, let's see, we've got like 8 minutes left, so.
My God, I talked that much?
Yeah,
Oh
no,
my
this is
God.
good. I just want to make sure, I want to
Yeah.
see if you have advice, because it has changed so much. The writers that I know are all freelance now, and
Yeah.
so you have to really think like an entrepreneur, from what just watching them always putting out feelers and pitching ideas, and then staying on top of, they might have a retainer with this magazine. Anyway, if you can explain a little bit about how they might launch a career as a writer, in this changing dynamic.
Well, I mean, it is really, really a tough time to do it, just because, like you said, and like I was saying before, the conventional job base has contracted a little bit. There will always be a purpose and a place and a need for people who can write intelligently and comprehensibly and stylishly. I don't think that's ever going to go away. You read blogs, you read a lot of what's out there, and you can sort out pretty quickly for yourself. This person is an enthusiast who is just writing in his bedroom for him or herself, whereas this person is actually, potentially a professional journalist. And that's not to cast aspersions on either. The beauty of the internet is that there's room for everybody and everything. Career advice is really, really hard at this moment, but what I would say is, if you are trying to pursue a track in journalism, then I'll tell you right now, you're not a writer. You are a producer of content. What we do at Time Out New York is no longer just about writing words on a word processor that get printed in a galley and eventually printed on a page. We are, updating the website ourselves in Drupal, and we are shooting and editing videos, and we're taking our own photos sometimes. You are very, very much a multimedia producer, and so having a working knowledge of the basics of digital photography and just a little bit of video shooting, and I'm not talking about anything elaborate. I'm talking about basically what you can do with an iPhone 4 or a flip cam. We do a series on Time Out New York's website that's called Live at Tony, where artists come into our office and play very, very stripped down short acoustic sets. We shoot those things with one of those little tiny pocket flip cams. We do minor editing, just a little bit at the front and the end, but it's all just one-shot steady cam, put it up on the web, and it gets enormous traffic because people just want to see what artists are doing. They want to see unique performances. This is something that happened one time and one time only. So having a little bit of versatility and flexibility with technology is absolutely an imperative now. Because the people at our magazine who view themselves as being purely writers are very dissatisfied now, because we're being pressed to do a whole lot of different things. But if you're into doing a whole lot of different things, and you can conceive of different ways to tell stories through slideshow images, through video, through audio, through a mix of all of these things, that's really the way to flourish nowadays. I mean, even the New York Times is doing, as traditional and stodgy and conservative as they are, and I swear to you they are, even they're doing more and more and more unique multimedia content on the web. It's just become what's expected of all of us now. And having a level of comfort and non-resistance to it is the way to succeed. But the other thing that I'm going to say, and this is like, it's so obvious that it doesn't even really bear repeating, except I'm going to, is just, if you want to be a writer, write all the time. And read what you've written, and read it again, and read it out loud if it makes sense. You know, the youngest writer on my staff, I just hired him about a year out of a university in Kansas City, because he had really great skills, great passion, a broad knowledge of the kind of pitchfork. You know, he's the guy who's got his thumb on all of the breaking indie bands. He's the guy who knew about Best Coast and Waves 3 years ago and not just 3 weeks ago like most of the rest of us. He was not the most polished writer, so what I basically work with him on is he's got a voice, he's got skills, he's got insight that none of that can be made up or faked. The basics of writing can be taught, and so basically what we work on is I just say, slow down, you just used the word song 5 times in 2 paragraphs, find other things to do, find synonyms, find other ways to express yourself. So really just write a lot, and then read what you've written and see if it satisfies you.
Great, that's great advice. All right, y'all. We're about out of time. Thank you.
I'm about out of voice.
I know, thank you.
Thank you.